An elderly woman was pushed by a thug on a train. Before a man wearing a cowboy hat got up and made all the changes, everyone was silent. Before we begin, let us know where you are currently viewing, and remember to subscribe if you enjoy this story. The tube let out a moan as it left the station. Wheels, metal screaming on metal shrieking. On a Monday morning, shoulder-to-shoulder traffic was heavy. In their separate worlds, the passengers pressed inward and avoided making eye contact. The air had a little metallic undertone and smelt of coffee and damp jackets. A woman stood by herself near the doors, her hair carefully pinned back, her beige coat buttoned at the top, and a faded canvas tote clasped against her chest. Her stance was cautious and dignified. She occupied a minimal room. On the other side of her splayed legs was a 20-something man with a loose phone glowing in his hand and a baseball cap turned back. He gave the woman a fleeting glance before going back to scrolling and tapping his foot to music that only he could hear. Beside him, there was an empty seat. The woman grinned cordially, her voice scarcely audible above a whisper. "Would you mind if I sat down, please?" None of the men looked up. "Train's full. Lady early claim of your seat is required." His leg was extended farther across the seat. A middle-aged man next to them shifted his glasses and turned away. No one spoke. The female didn't dispute. She simply stood there, swaying in time with the vehicle. She pulled her arms around the bag, which included a jar of strawberry preserves, a loaf of bread, and 2 apples. She had gotten up early for the market, like she had done every Monday since she retired. The tube violently turned a bend and rocked. With one hand steadying against the pole, she braced herself as the lights above flickered and the automobile dipped. She touched the young man's arm with her shoulder. With an exaggerated gesture, he jerked away, barking, "Don't touch me, hag." Heads turned and eyes glanced over phones before swiftly turning away once more. The woman backed up slightly to give him room. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't respond. Her hold on the bag became more firm. The man leaned forward with a smile. "It's louder now. You guys really can't even travel on the train in peace without someone encroaching on your personal space." Nobody replied. On the other side of the aisle was a teenage girl wearing a school uniform. She never hit a record even though her fingers were hovering over her phone's camera. The man then extended his hand to tap the woman's tote. He laughed and flicked the strap with 2 fingers, asking, "Grandma, what's in the bag that's worth fighting over?" She gave a small shake of her head. She whispered, "Please don't." But he continued. He reached again, this time holding the bag's bottom and tilting it, not to cause pain. 1 apple dropped, while the other rolled beneath the chairs. She let out a faint cry and leaned over, supporting herself on one knee, to try to pick up the fruit as the jar moved, but did not shatter. Then the elbow violently jerked his arm back towards her with quick deliberation, not a shove or punch, and it caught her just beneath the collarbone. She staggered sideways, slamming her back dually against the subway door's metal frame. Although the collision wasn't very loud, the silence that ensued was deafening. A puffer-jacketed child opens his mouth and then shuts it again. An elderly lady used her scarf to hide her lips. The adolescent girl stepped forward and then back, but nobody moved. The man leaned back in his chair, feeling proud of himself. He taught the crowd, rather than her, to not rely on strangers, but nobody said anything. But in the distance, past the bodies, the poles, and the noise, inside the automobile. After standing the entire trip with one hand on the overhead bar and one boot planted slightly wider than the other, one man slowly raised his head. An old cowboy's face was gloomy. His leather coat was damaged by the sun and time. His beard was grey like hers, and his eyes were always moving. Everything was visible to him, and the train was just starting to move into the next tunnel. As it rattled farther into the tunnel, the sound of steel against steel filled the stillness like a second heartbeat. Reaching for the fallen apples rolling under the chairs, the woman lowered herself carefully to the ground, her legs cracking. She fumbled with trembling fingers. instead of moving to assist the guy seated in front of her after one of the apples rolled past his legs. He sighed loudly, leaned forward with both elbows on his knees and smiled, saying, "Oh, come on, you're going to crawl now. It's just fruit." She did not respond. Her fingers reached for the final apple beneath his boot, which he lifted before slamming it down. The apple exploded with a bland crunch, juices dripping from a tiny cut like blood across the dirty floor. The crowd winced. The elderly lady raised her head. They looked at each other, and he lifted an eyebrow and cocked his head as if he had just swatted a bug. "You done?" he remarked almost nonchalantly. She remained silent as she picked up the second apple, which was bruised, and the jar jam, which was still there but scraped. Her hand trembled, as if uncertain whether to stay or leave. The train lights behind her flickered once more. The man in the cowboy hat moved from the opposite end of the vehicle. Without pushing anyone away, he didn't rush. Instead, he just started to move slowly and deliberately past the woman with her phone caught in midair, the college student cradling her child, and the mother holding her child. Because he was so busy performing, the bandit didn't notice him yet. He turned to face the other cars. You see, this is what happens when people realize they're not unique. Respect. I owe no one anything. Everyone believes they are given a seat simply because they are elderly, worn out, or whatever. Nobody replied. A teenager put down his phone and gazed at the ground. The elderly woman steadied herself on the pole and forced herself to stand up. Her sagging shoulders were caused by the weight of public shame rather than aging. Next followed the deep, controlled silence that sounded like a blade slipping out of its sheath. "Grab it." After blinking in confusion, the bandit turned his head. Chuck Norris was standing only 2 feet behind him. Nearer now, the air around him looked thinner because he was so close. His coat's leather made a gentle creaking sound as he shifted into position. "What?" The criminal let out a bark. Chuck failed to blink at the fruit. "Take it back and say you're sorry." The automobile felt a ripple that shook it like a faraway earthquake. One woman backed down a little. A record was hit by someone. Initially trembling, the thug's laughter grew louder. "Are you serious, man? Who are you meant to be, her spouse?" Sheriff Chuck remained silent as he took another step forward, still smiling, and leaned back to address the throng. "We got a whole John Wayne situation here," he exclaimed. The bandit now got to his feet, tilting his chin to keep his height while attempting to regain control. "What's wrong, elderly man?" There was no snarl or threat, simply a statement as straightforward and solid as gravity itself. Chuck's voice was like gravel being dragged across stone. "She was hurt. You did it. Now fix it." The bandit peered around, but nobody turned away this time. He rolled his shoulders in an attempt to puff up. Chuck cocked his head, saying, "Back off. I'm warning you." The tension had subsided. It had, too, a standstill. Heavy, alive. Then, just as it was about to shatter, a piercing voice spoke out from behind. "You need assistance, guy." It originated from a different young man 2 rows down, who had a thicker jacket that zipped up to his chin and had his headphones out. Chuck, a companion of another thug, didn't turn. The thug in front grinned more broadly. Watch as Chuck carefully rotated his head, looking at the second man and then returning to the first. Behind him, the woman tightened her grip on her luggage. This was no longer only a shove. It had nothing to do with pride or fruit. The line was drawn at that point, and Chuck Norris had already crossed it. Chuck didn't respond. He simply stood, there with his hat brim cast in a soft shadow over his eyes, having witnessed things men like this wouldn't survive. The young man squared his shoulders like a dog puffing itself up, trying to grow teeth he didn't have, and he took a half-step towards Chuck, jabbing a thumb at himself. "You got a problem, cowboy, because if you do, you should know I don't back down for nobody." Chuck's stance was unaffected by the train's mild swaying as it crossed a track switch. He didn't flinch or reach for anything, and his arms rested loosely at his sides. Phones were now out of the car, not just one or two, but a dozen, and boots were planted across it like they were growing from the metal floor. However, nobody said. They were all watching for something they didn't really get, and they didn't smirk or laugh. From the left, the second thug with the heavier face began to move in. "Old man, you want to be dropped." Chuck said nothing, since we don't care who you believe you are. The man in front of him waved a hand in Chuck's face while continuing to act as if he was in charge. "This was your first time in the city, and you lost what you were deaf." Chuck didn't even blink. He turned carefully to see how his wife was doing. She remained close to the door. Her face was pale as she clasped the bag to her bosom, but her eyes were fixed on his back with a silent faith. Chuck spun around and met the thug's gaze directly. After that, he said, "Low, tranquil, final. This is your final opportunity." The remarks were spoken as if the train were coming, as if the sun were setting, without being yelled or given with bluster. "My final opportunity. To what?" The lead thug snorted. "Get some fruit for your grandmother. Leave this place." He pushed Chuck's chest with his outstretched palm. Something changed in the air when Chuck took a half-inch step back, not because he had to, but because he allowed the pressure to flow through him like wind past a tree. No one cheered or gasped, but the hush grew heavier, the kind of silence that precedes a rainstorm. This time the thug pressed harder, saying, "You don't want to do this, old man, trust me." Chuck glanced back at his wife and said, "Are you hurt?" She gave a small nod. "A little." Chuck then turned back to see the young man, but something in that gaze changed. The tenderness was away and something colder took its place. Focus on not fury, not rage. He moved forward a step. The bandit shoved right away again, but Chuck grasped his wrist in midair this time, just enough to stop it, without being rough or violent. The man's arm seemed to have struck steel abruptly. He blinked and attempted to pull it back, but Chuck's hold didn't need to get tighter because the man was immobile. Chuck then slowly cocked his head once more. "I told you," behind him. The second guy moved uncomfortably. Halfway down the car, he glanced at the third man who was still seated. His gaze darted between Chuck and the other passengers' phones. The railcar's weight had entirely changed. This was judgment. It was no longer a viral video. Irreversible and measured quiet. At last, the first UG pulled his arm free and took a step back. "Hey, this man is insane. Simply leave, guy. You're not worthy." But Chuck sat in that silence, the kind that makes even tube wheels feel muffled, wrapping the car like a cocoon without moving, posing, or threatening. People began to put down their phones out of respect rather than boredom. A whisper was heard. "He hasn't even hit anyone." The first thug gave the second another look. "Man, let's go." However, it was too late. Since lines had already been crossed and Chuck hadn't moved since, the stillness in the tube car was no longer uneasy. Rather, it was the moment when a man made a decision and another guy had to live with it. It was thick with electricity. The air itself felt heavier, as though the train itself were holding its breath. Every vibration from the track seemed to be amplified. The thug gave a shaky laugh and attempted to brush it off. "You guys are making him seem unique." He feigned another laugh as he turned to face Chuck. "You're going to take a 6-shooter out of that cowboy jacket?" Chuck remained still. "Come on, look at him. What will he do?" The young man went back to the throng and gestured with both hands like a street entertainer. "Give me a lesson. Giving me some advice from my grandfather." In an attempt to regain his former supremacy, his voice increased. "Do you really think I'm going to go get a bag of groceries?" I inquired politely to a guy in a thrift store. Chuck simply changed his position without saying anything further. Seldom, but those in attendance took note. A little change in weight, with the arms relaxed and the feet somewhat wider apart. That was it, and it made the thug feel more uneasy. than yelling ever could. The man scowled as his voice became erratic. "You're not even wearing a badge. You're not a police officer. You're nothing." Chuck slowly cocked his head. "I'm her husband." In 3 words that are barely audible but have a force greater than a fist, Chuck took a step closer once the guy blinked. "You wounded her," Chuck muttered, as their distance shrank to less than an arm's length. "Pick up her luggage." The thug's laughter cracked in the middle this time. A lifeless, dry voice. "No, I don't work in charity." Chuck's voice remained unchanged. "This is not philanthropic. This is the final kind request you will receive today." The second thug approached from the car's corner, realizing that the tension was about to collapse. He said, "You think we're afraid of you?" and used a voice sharpener. "We now govern the city. You are merely passing through." Chuck at last turned to look him in the face. He fixed his eyes and didn't look away. "I've experienced worse," he said. A few passengers genuinely shuddered because of the way he delivered the words, which sounded like data from a ledger. Back to the first thug, the second man hesitated and finally stopped. Chuck did not advance once again. He only stared and waited, but the weight of that silence was too much to take. As you can see, the bandit attempted to fake his way out. A dumb bag is what you desire. He leaned down and carefully used 2 fingers to pick up the wounded toe from the ground, as if it were contaminated. He gestured to Chuck's wife, who was still standing motionless by the back door. However, he dropped it purposefully and let the apples tumble again as she was leaving. The glass jar jamb eventually came loose and cracked when it hit something. "Slip," he replied mockingly. A group of people in the car inhaled. Chuck raised his gaze to the shattered jar. A strawberry preserve stain resembles blood at a murder scene on the metal floor. When it rolled, 1 apple gently hit his boot. He raised his gaze again. The thug shrugged, grinning proudly once more. "Oh," Chuck looked at him, the stone-faced. He then inquired, "Do you have a mother?" in a soft voice. The criminal paused. "A sister." "What does that have to do?" Chuck moved forward, his eyes blazing like embers. "This is where you stop," he remarked, "so you should be aware of it." A ripple went through the throng once more. The criminal attempted to maintain his position, but his feet moved a little. His self-assurance faltered, his cockiness changed into something else. Tension and confusion followed by a threat of terror. There were still no punches exchanged, but a man across the aisle muttered, "He's serious." Even though there was no shouting yet, everyone understood that something merited and inevitable was going to happen. Nobody was watching the tunnel anymore. Instead, everyone was watching him as the train swayed slightly and the wheels clicked, in a constant slow pattern like a clock counting down. For a few while the thug stood still, torn between awkwardly increasing discomfort and pride. He was apparently winning despite the elder man in front of him, the stranger wearing a dusty hat and worn boots, not raising a hand or even raising his voice. The fact that the thug didn't get it infuriated him, so he came forward once more to confront Chuck. Chuck didn't respond. "You believe this is a movie. You think he can frighten me with some cowboy grandpa joke. Nothing at all." With a forceful shove, the thug Chuck didn't trip or even startle. The motion, akin to pushing on a tree trunk, was absorbed and redirected. Chuck tilted his head slightly to the side and glanced at his wife, who was still clutching the torn canvas tote fingers, as he said in a quiet voice, "Are you hurt?" "A little," she responded. "This is your last chance," Chuck replied, his expression remaining the same, but something behind his eyes changed. The thug noticed it too late. The thug and the audience both heard it, but instead of backtracking, the man did what individuals like him always do when they see their authority eroding. He swung out and shoved twice, more forcefully this time. Chuck backed up a single step. The second criminal entered now as well, approaching from the side but not with intent or force. "You think I'll let you leave with that expression on your face?" He sneered. "No, elderly man, you're going to learn something," and Chuck changed his position. His hands had not yet been raised. The guy grabbed Chuck's shoulder with a sly smile. Maybe to swing, maybe to push. Yet he never touched. Chuck did not move much. An adjustment to the equilibrium. His center of gravity dipped slightly. An inward and leftward step. The thug was caught by his right hand at the wrist. Not pulled, not contorted, just directed, and the rest was done by the man's own gravity. With a grunt, he went down in a trance and collided with the tube wall when he lost his equilibrium and staggered forward, causing Chuck to release him. A ripple of gasps ran through the train. The other guy lunged and swore. This time, Chuck didn't think twice. His right leg slid beneath the attacker's ankle as his left arm snapped upward, altering the man's trajectory. He deflected the man's weight with a sharp pit of the hip, causing him to fall flat and reverberate against the steel floor. When the automobile burst, there were cries, gasps, and phones being lifted once more. But Chuck remained silent. Instead, he turned to face the first thug, who was now frozen in mid-step, staring wide-eyed. "You should have walked away," Chuck remarked. Chuck took one step closer, while the guy struggled to complete a statement. After backing up, the man backed up, once again, and collided with the closing tube door. There wasn't anywhere to go, he noticed. Chucked, but instead he leaned down and carefully scooped up the remnants of the groceries that had dropped. One smashed apple, a cracked jar, and an empty bag. He brought it with him and gave it to his spouse. She nodded despite her hand shaking, as she accepted it, not because she was afraid, but because she knew Chuck had turned back to the thug for one last time. There was no doubt about the message. You had one last chance and you blew it. For a while everything seemed to be finished. The first thug was holding his hands up against the tube doors, not in submission but in bewilderment. The second one was moaning on the ground. The third had not yet left his seat when he became abruptly preoccupied with the linoleum's cracks. Chuck gently rested one arm at his side and wrapped the other around his wife as he stood quietly close to the center of the train car. He was breathing steadily and his shoulders were at ease. Not everyone received the message, but it appeared that the threat had passed. And there's always another. A fourth man got out of the vehicle from a far corner where the lights flickered and the seats shook close to the intersection of two train cars. Up until now, no one had seen him. The hoodie up, hands deep in his jacket, watching. The others were posing, but he wasn't. He moved methodically and silently. He wasn't noisy. His nearest passengers leaned away. A female voice said, "Who is that?" The man moved forward as Chuck turned to face his wife, but it was too late to respond. He held a short, thick baton plastic in his right hand, reinforced, like the ones small cops wear, but he swung it with a little more weight. In an instant, the baton shot skyward and struck Chuck's skull just above the ear. The sound, which sounded like a baseball bat striking meat, was thick and heavy rather than crisp. Immediately, Chuck's knees gave way. Beside him, his right shoulder struck the steel pole. With his head slightly rebounding on the metal, his torso crumpled sideways and struck the tube floor with force. His spouse yelled. Someone dropped their phone and several people yelled, and suddenly the whole tube vehicle plunged into anarchy. As he stood over Chuck, the thug with the baton began to breathe heavily, his chest rising and sinking. His face was not arrogant. It seemed as though this was a duty or a job. He remained silent, and Chuck remained motionless. When the car initially noticed him still, one hand might have twitched in a reflex. Afterward, nothing. Stepping back, the baton's thug breathed through his nose. His sleeve eyes swept over the throng as he wiped his brow, almost saying, "See? That's all it takes." "Did he just kill him?" one man murmured. Another shuddering voice, "No, he's breathing." The thugs who had previously dropped the grocery bag blinked frantically. Like I said, he was a phony. He spoke with more tremor now, still sitting, slumped. Against the door was the first one. Chuck's spouse knelt down next to him and placed both hands on his chest. Charles, have a look at me." "Nothing, please," she said haltingly. A breath followed by clear but superficial. Chuck's eyes came open, only sufficiently wide to indicate that he was still engaged in combat. He blinked twice. On the filthy tube floor, his fingers flexed. The baton-wielding bandit raised it once more. "Don't." Chuck's spouse said the harsh words. "Get up." Despite the lack of strength in her voice, her clarity was tremendous. After pausing, the man arrogantly said, "Stay out of it, lady." He moved a step forward. Chuck's left leg shifted at that point, just enough. Placing his elbow behind him, he used his other hand to find the pole. He started to methodically and slowly raise himself up, much like a man who had fallen a lot but always got back up. A thug with a baton paused. Now Chuck had heavy crimson streaks of blood running down his right temple. His teeth were clenched. He stared a man in the eyes, and something in that gaze made him instantly heavier in the thug's palm. His body swayed for a second before straightening. Chuck didn't speak, but his body language spoke for him. "Now it's my turn. The atmosphere within the tube car has changed. Charged. Not scared, not louder." Chuck slowly stood there with blood seeping down his jacket collar from his temple. He was supported by his left arm on the pole, his right hand, which was slightly twisted and wounded at the knuckles. He inhaled deeply and steadily without swaying or shaking. The baton-wielding man blinked, uncertain whether to charge or retreat, but Chuck moved before he could make up his mind. He wasn't quick or showy, simply inadequate. The baton was too long for him to swing since he moved in near enough. Yet, the thug made an attempt. Chuck was leaning inside the strike zone when the baton reached his shoulder. In mid-stride, his left hand lifted and grabbed the man's wrist, halting the force. Chuck then turned, grabbed the man's elbow with his hips, and twisted. The baton fell with a hollow clang to the ground. Throughout the subway car there was a gasp. The thug fell backward and collided with one of the metal poles as Chuck moved forward once more, put a palm on the man's chest, and gave him a gentle but firm shove. His head jerked back, causing him to fall on one knee. Chuck didn't chase after him, but he wasn't out either. He turned slowly, blood still streaming from his face, and turned to face the first thug, the one who had shoved his wife. They made eye contact. The younger man went cold. Chuck approached him by taking a step. "That's sufficient." The doors of the automobile were still closed when the thug turned in a panic and attempted to flee to the opposite side. Outside the tube, it is still dark. Screaming, "Open, open!" he banged on the emergency panel. Chuck proceeded calmly and deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world. The thug fumbled with the panel, then turned and punched in desperation. Chuck ducked slightly, turned sideways, and allowed the punch to pass him without landing. Then he hooked his forearm around the man's elbow and yanked, leveraging the thug's own momentum. The guy let out a scream and slumped, holding his arm. As a crack reverberated throughout the car, Chuck turned away. For the sake of breathing, not to boast or pose, another 2 down. Finally, the second thug, who had been threatening with a yell, moved. He roared and charged, his arms spread wide like a linebacker attempting to tackle a man half his size. Chuck hesitated, then ducked. The man slammed onto a bench seat chest first after flying past him and tripping over his fallen friend's legs. With a pitiful wheeze, the wind exited his lungs. Chuck turned, but the man with the baton wasn't done yet. He was standing up once more, his face flushed and angry, and now he was seething with embarrassment. He seized the metal pole next to him and propelled himself forward with it. This time there is no weapon, just rage and fists. Chuck Duck dodged the first punch that rolled under the second as he swung madly, saying something that no one could even understand. Then suddenly, A quick elbow to the stomach, sharp and deep. Chuck took advantage of the opening while the man gasped, returned inside and gave the guy a shoulder check that caused him to fall off his feet and into the wall like a bag of wet cement. The man fell. He remained downstairs this time. Beneath him, the locomotive rumbled as though it had seen something ancient. Chuck steadied his equilibrium by standing motionless with one hand against a subway wall. Blood still trickled down his temple, but his eyes were laser-focused throughout the vehicle as his chest rose and fell. The passenger began to move closer rather than farther away. A young man in a sweatshirt muttered, "He just pulled out 4 guys." A woman whispered by the doors, waited until he had to punch someone else before he ever did so. He differs from the rest. Chuck stepped back towards his wife, who was motionless but had sparkling eyes. He reached down and picked up the crumpled tote bag once more. There was only 1 apple left, so he gently gave it to her. Chuck nodded, and the train was motionless for a little moment as her hand shook as she took it. Everyone sensed it, yet nobody applauded or clapped. This was a significant event that none of them will soon forget. Under the city, the train rushed on, its wheels whirring against the tracks, yet there was silence within the car. 3 men were moaning on the ground. One was stooped over a bench and the other was curled up next to the sliding doors. The final one sagged against a pole, gripping his ribs and muttering obscenities that sounded less courageous. The 4th, the one with the baton, had remained still. He was simply silent and defeated rather than comatose. Standing in the middle of it all was Chuck Norris. There was no blood on his knuckles, no words, no wild breath. His eyes were softly shadowed by his cowboy hat. Even a giant can bleed and remain upright, as evidenced by the red stain that still traveled from his temple to his jawline and was now drying. He turned to face his wife. She hadn't spoken since he gave her the apple, but her hold had become firmer. She moved forward just enough to get near to him and grabbed his arm, which Chuck allowed her to grasp. Only a lady finding her footing, next to the man who would never let her fall, no hero attitude, no acclaim. The remainder of the tube car remained silent as they observed. As if sensing that this wasn't satisfactory, a youngster by the emergency exit carefully lowered his phone to something else. A man wearing a jacket and sporting a Bluetooth earpiece just removed the gadget from his ear. A mother cradled her daughter's watery eyes. She didn't mutter anything. One of the earlier goons coughed once in the corner and instantly felt bad about it. Chuck reached down and grabbed up the batter tote bag once more without even looking at him. Despite being torn, the canvas held. Using one hand, he lightly dusted it before slipping it over his shoulder. A hand was placed on his back by his spouse. After the car took another corner, the lights overhead flickered, and for a brief moment, it was only them. Standing in the middle of a storm that neither of them requested nor fled, the man who had broken the stillness was no longer merely standing in front of them, he was now a part of it. No one dared to move or talk. Nobody really heard the elderly man in the back whispering something, but his eyes were moist and his lips formed the words, "Thank you." The train slowed down. As it got closer to the next station, the sound of steel against steel reverberated throughout the tunnel. A voice that sounded robotically said, "Next stop Lexington and 63rd. Nobody has moved yet." Chuck was standing close to the middle of the vehicle, his hat slightly cocked, blood drying against his temple. His wife's head rested just below his shoulder as she tenderly grasped his arm. Together, they confronted the ride's last moments as though it was simply another stop on a typical day rather than as a spectacle. But now, nothing about this was typical. A child, perhaps 12 or 13, tugged at his mother's sleeve near the emergency entrance. "Mom," he mumbled. Was that Chuck Norris? His mother took a while to respond. She saw the man's silent breathing and the way he returned a ripped grocery bag to his wife as if it were still significant. She nodded once at the way his fists remained low but never weak. The boy's eyes widened, and he remained silent. "I think that was Chuck Norris," a man whispering to a woman next to him, wearing a gray scarf, leaned a few feet away. She simply gripped her purse more tightly without replying. "Did you see how he moved?" muttered someone across the aisle. "I've never seen anything like it, not in real life." The first thug, who had shoved Chuck's wife and dropped her bag, was still curled up against the door at the far end of the car, clutching his dislocated elbow. He looked up, his eyes blinking in shock, and he stopped sneering, talking, and acting like he understood the game because he finally knew whose game it was. Chuck ignored him and everyone else, staring at the doorhead, and waited for it to open so he could go in the same manner as he had trodden on something unexpected, unannounced, and unforgettable. When the train stopped, it hissed. The doors squeaked open, letting the platform see dim morning light. Chuck turned to face his wife and whispered, "You ready?" She nodded, and he led her forward with a gentle hand behind her back. They moved past the crowd together. Nobody obstructed their path. As they disembarked from the train, a man at the front leaned forward, still holding his phone, and began recording in stunned quiet. He didn't shout or zoom in. He just said to himself, "That was Chuck Norris." No one talked. Everyone parted out of respect, not fear. And everyone in that automobile knew they would never forget the moment Chuck stood bleeding and remained upright, even though he never turned around. The station was silent, but not as silent as the tube car had been. Rather, it was hushed, like a city holding its breath until life returned. Chuck and his spouse removed their train boots and loafers, softly stepping onto the yellow tactile strip that ran along the perimeter. Behind them, the doors hissed in and out. It seemed as though the car waited for them to vanish first. Chuck didn't hurry and never did. The train hadn't moved yet, and nobody inside had either. As they moved past the first tile column and then the next, he maintained his touch softly on the small of his wife's back. She stared up at him after he turned around. Only a glance was shared, no words. Behind them, the familiar, steady silence had always been sufficient. With a loud thump, the train doors finally close. The passengers within stay motionless. Phones were still up, and some people's lips were still slightly open as they tried to process what they had just seen. Chuck led his wife to the stairway, but none of the four guys on the floor attempted to follow him. She was scared and moved a little more slowly than normal, but she didn't trip. He followed her pace, never pushing or pulling, just walking next to her. By the time they arrived at the summit, the city's cacophony had resumed. Street talk, car horns, and the high-pitched pigeons scuffling over crumbs. Sunlight splashed on the concrete landing and poured through the dirty stairway grate. As they came out, Chuck lowered his cap. Nobody outside was aware of what had occurred. Nobody knew who he was. He didn't provide answers, and nobody asked questions. A woman laughed too loudly into her phone as a bus drove up across the street, and a cyclist sped by. Life continued without realizing that just below something had occurred. He and his spouse crossed the roadway slowly after a line was placed. Chuck took the crumpled grocery list she had scribbled earlier that morning out of his pocket. It had been folded twice and was now wrinkled at the corners. He read it as though it were scripture, with a tiny red streak from his hand on one side. With a little smile, she replied, "Only if they're ripe." "Still want the apples?" he inquired. "Always are." They rounded a bend. There would be no headlines discussing what transpired. For those who had been in that tube car, for the child holding his mother, the woman with the pocketbook, and the men who believed that strength comes from noise, it would never be merely a morning commute again. No medals would be given out, and no viral video would ever fully convey the impact of that stillness. On that day, they would witness a guy bleed without falling, protected without yelling, and standing without the necessity for lifting. Chuck held the corner grocery store door open for his wife. As they entered, a bell sounded, and the street behind them absorbed their tracks, just like any other pair would on any other day. One more stop.